Good evening. Founding Director of the Regional Studies Center, Richard Geragosyan, will sit down with the first Analytical tonight. Mr. Geragosyan, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.
2 years after the 44-day war and 9 drafts of the peace treaty later, there is very little tangible progress. Would you say that a peace process is what's happening, or is this a simulation of it between Baku and Yerevan?
That's a good question. I would argue that it's neither about peace nor much of a process. What we generally see is a maximalist Azerbaijan imposing unilateral concessions and demands from Armenia. And what we see is a limited diplomatic engagement by Azerbaijan, largely defined by insincerity. For example, and to be specific, Azerbaijan makes consistent and constant demands from Armenia, but with each new demand and threat from Azerbaijan, they don't even wait for an answer. And in many times, it's largely driven by domestic political dividends for the Aliyev regime. In other words, using aggressive rhetoric, using conflict to justify their position in power.
Well, after months of disagreeing on a negotiation platform, Armenia and Azerbaijan finally chose an unexpected one, Kazakhstan and Almaty. Symbolically, what role do you believe will a new platform play in finalizing a peace treaty, hopefully?
If we look at this coming Almaty meeting in Kazakhstan between the Armenian and Azerbaijani foreign ministers, there's an interesting historical context here. As we remember, Kazakhstan was one of the signatories from the 1994 ceasefire over Nagorno-Karabakh. Kazakhstan at one point even tried to become a member of the OSCE Minsk group. But most significantly is the symbolism. The so-called Almaty Declaration is what served as the basis for the partial agreement on border demarcation recently. And that Almaty Treaty was basically recognizing the current borders of both Armenia and Azerbaijan, serving as a basis for negotiations. But the Kazakhs have been very careful to point out they are not seeking to mediate, they are facilitating. And what it represents is a compromise. Azerbaijan is seeking no third-party involvement, no Washington, no Brussels, and no Moscow. This represents a step closer to bring it back to the region, but I don't expect much from the Kazakhs, but more from the talks between the Armenian and Azerbaijani foreign ministers in terms of where do we go after this partial border demarcation agreement. However, a final note of warning. Every diplomatic summit between Armenia and Azerbaijan has been dangerously vulnerable to sabotage by the Azerbaijani defense minister to undercut his rival, the foreign minister. So we may expect, unfortunately, a limited border skirmish or some kind of provocation militarily from Azerbaijan to derail the diplomatic process and progress.
Azerbaijan's approach is what is mine and what is yours is negotiable. How to keep Azerbaijan on the track of constructive dialogue?
Well, the good news is this. Azerbaijan is in a much weaker position than it realizes. It's a position of weakness, not strength, of insecurity and not confidence in terms of a greater degree of diplomatic isolation. We see now moves by the US Congress and the EU in terms of examining sanctions against Azerbaijan, canceling visits, and taking measures designed to punish Azerbaijan for failing to return sincerely to negotiations. However, from the Armenian side, there are both concessions and compromises tempting Azerbaijan to come back. And the reason we should expect Azerbaijan to continue engaging Armenia is not just because of Armenia's weakness, but because it's an acceptance of the terms of Azerbaijan. There is no European Union involvement or American, nor is there Russian involvement. Lately, these have been meetings and negotiations bilaterally. This is what Azerbaijan has long demanded. So, whether we like it or not, this is likely to continue.
Do these asymmetrical bilateral talks not bother you? Since Baku uses the occasion to exert pressure, let me bring you an example. As you mentioned, a recent agreement was reached between Baku and Yerevan, and a certain about 12 kilometers of the border were delimited, and 2.5 villages were in fact transferred to Azerbaijan. Do you believe that this is delimitation, or is this unilateral concessions under pressure exactly because of the bilateral format of talks?
It's a very good question, and to be honest, the answer is both. I also think the beginning of your question, everyone should be concerned about the asymmetrical nature, the unilateral nature from Azerbaijan. If we look at the recent border delineation agreement, it is important as the first ever negotiation that was successful, and it was again without the Russians, for example, but it was only between 10 and 12 kilometers. It was a very small portion. However, the process is restarting, if you will. What we see, however, in the bigger picture, Azerbaijan continues to escalate its maximalist demands. And up until now, all concessions and compromises have been unilateral, have been from Armenia, with Azerbaijan doing nothing and giving less. What this means is, in my opinion, the Armenian government is now at a point where the time for unilateral concessions has passed. There has to be conditionality, linkage. Azerbaijan has to reciprocate. The second recommendation for the Armenian government is we have to differentiate between what is a real Azerbaijani demand or interest and what is bellicose rhetoric just for domestic purposes. We respond and react too often. Instead, we need to realize silence is a policy option sometimes.
Right after his visits to Moscow, Aliyev set forth 3 preconditions again. One is Armenia should change its constitution. Second, you should remove your national symbol, Mount Ararat. And third, you should provide us with communication between Azerbaijan and Nakhichevan. Which of these have any legitimate grounds? And or do you believe this is simply sabotaging the peace process?
Well, of the 3 preconditions, what we see is an example of the challenge facing Armenia to differentiate what's real and what's not, what requires a response and what should be ignored. The first 2, changing the Armenian constitution and the symbolism of Mount Ararat, even sources in Baku and Turkey were surprised that Armenia took up this issue. Moreover, this is much more of a domestic script, political script within Azerbaijan that Armenia should not necessarily respond to. If the Armenian government wants to change the constitution, it needs to do a better job at defining and articulating why and what it wants to change. Moreover, the only real prerequisite or precondition is, of course, the restoration of trade and transport, the road and railway link through southern Armenia. But that's not a unilateral project. Azerbaijan, as much as Armenia, has to ensure the security and the confidence in this project. This is why the term of the Zangezur corridor is both irrelevant but also inaccurate.
Aliyev partially resurrected the November 9 document, which supposes a communication between Azerbaijan and Armenia. But this is a politically dead document, since 8 points have not been carried out by any of the sides. Is Pashinyan legally bound to carry out the 1 point that is left on this paper?
The easy answer is no. The longer answer or explanation is exactly what you pointed to in your question. The Azerbaijani side has resurrected partial or selective points from a document that no longer applies. The Russian crafted, Russian imposed ceasefire that ended the war of 2020 was about a very different reality that is no longer the case, and it was also about Nagorno-Karabakh. In terms of now, under international law and diplomacy, this document is moot, it's irrelevant, it's a historical footnote. Therefore, the selective reference to just parts of this agreement are not necessarily real nor binding on either side. However, Azerbaijan's selective use of specific points should actually be better pushed back, better, let's say, Armenia's response should do a better job at showing the lack of legitimacy of Azerbaijani claims or demands.
If we get to the crux of the problem, should Armenia provide communication between Azerbaijan and Nakhichevan or not?
I think the easy answer is yes. In other words, communication, trade, transport, reopening of borders is a win-win. It's a common good. And yes, Armenia should be involved. The real question, however, is the operational details. Under what terms, under whose management, and exactly what is involved.
Well, if
But
November
overall,
9 is resurrected, that means that the Russians should be watching the border.
the November agreement will not be resurrected because
Aliyev is trying
no
to do
longer,
this.
I don't think it will work, because if we look at the international community, it's not binding nor recognized. Moreover, what we see overall, Armenia does have an opportunity, an advantage of becoming a transit state. And I would argue trade and transport, road and rail links are important strategically for Armenia for one reason. In an effort to regain deterrence, such a reopening will change the balance of power and the calculation, making renewed hostilities or attacks from Azerbaijan much more expensive in terms of losing any kind of trade links and road and rail infrastructure. But what we also see is this Russian involvement may come about largely because not of the agreement, but because of Armenia's membership in the Eurasian Economic Union. In other words, Russian Eurasian Economic Union involvement in customs and tax through these road and rail connections is likely, largely because it's about external borders. And I don't think Armenia has the leverage to avoid having Russian participation. But to be provocative, I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing. In other words, to have Russia in as a stakeholder in the restoration of regional trade and transport, that might be more effective than forcing them out as a spoiler to sabotage the process. And for Armenia, it also balances the role of Turkey.
From the way you make it sound, seems like being a part of this process of normalization, regulation, or the peace process, call it as you wish, that there is no point doing this, because that is not what Baku wants, that is not what they're aiming at, and the whole process brings to Yerevan's unilateral concessions.
Actually, I welcome the question because it's our first point of disagreement. In other words, precisely because of Azerbaijan's stubborn maximalism, Armenia should be engaged. In other words, Armenia has more to gain by maximizing the contrast, where Azerbaijan should correctly be seen as the impediment to regional stability, as the threat to regional security. Armenia is endowed with a rare commodity of legitimacy and also stability, more than any of her neighbors. And in this context, Armenia should remain engaged, but should also sometimes become more self-confident. In other words, Armenia should actually threaten to boycott a scheduled meeting when necessary, should also threaten to walk away.
Do you not believe that Baku is trying to find a pretext for another attack? Because even if Armenia has the diplomatic support of the West, Baku is strong in terms of the military now and has the backup of Turkey, now even Russia, a strategic ally that we basically lost to Baku during the peace process, or to be more accurate, after the 44-day war.
Again, I diplomatically disagree. In other words, the risk of renewed war, in my opinion, militarily is unlikely for two reasons. The Azerbaijani armed forces of today is very different than in 2020. There's much less Turkish support, there's much less Turkish presence militarily, and no longer the UAV, the drone support, the Air Force contribution from the Turkish military. Moreover, Azerbaijan's military capabilities have not been upgraded since 2020 regarding Armenia. But the second point is the Azerbaijani armed forces is much less of a threat. The Armenian armed forces is also different from 2020. It is actually much more capable to defend Armenia proper, unlike in 2020, where the overwhelming majority of the fighting, the combat theater, was outside of Armenia's borders. Moreover, I think Azerbaijan's move against Armenia would actually raise the stakes, where they would become overextended in terms of one country attacking another. But for this reason, where I agree with you, is Armenia needs to do much more to begin again talking about the illegal occupation of Armenian territory. Azerbaijani armed forces, military units, remain on nearly 200 square kilometers of Armenian territory. This should be a condition prior to any further agreement.
International partners welcomed the agreement to delimitate according to Almaty declaration, but since according to the same Almaty, Azerbaijan, as you mentioned, now occupies about 200 kilometers of Armenian sovereign territory, there's concern that at a certain point, Azerbaijan will withdraw from the declaration and leave its armed forces where they stand now. Do you see it preventing that?
Well, I think that risk is real. I also think that Azerbaijan has made a mistake, however. In other words, for Azerbaijan to establish the precedent in this recent agreement by accepting again the Almaty Declaration, yet again recognizing the Republic of Armenia's borders, it's a mistake because now it's much more difficult for Azerbaijan to walk away or to renounce that deal. Moreover, I think what we see is the presence of the Azerbaijani military units on Armenian territory. I don't see that as a genuine territorial demand. It's more about pressuring Armenia and maintaining the initiative on the ground. Vulnerability and security of Armenia is magnified by their presence. However, militarily, we do not see any signs of military construction, engineering projects to make that presence permanent. So I do think it could be more of a bargaining chip. But this is for the very same reason, this is why the Armenian government needs to establish conditionality, linking their withdrawal by Azerbaijani forces to any future or coming agreement.
Aliyev continues to deny Armenia its right to self-defense as more Western countries seem to be offering it. What's your comment on this?
Well, I think yet again an example where the Azerbaijani president is actually talking to his own society, trying to distract from the lack of democracy and from his family corruption. Such a demand or a statement from any country to its neighboring country is rather ridiculous. Azerbaijan has no power and no standing or position to actually dictate how Armenia can rebuild its defense capabilities. Moreover, I think as we see with the French, the Indian, and the Western assistance in security, there's no one taking Aliyev seriously. So we shouldn't make the mistake in Armenia of also giving legitimacy to his rather outlandish claims.
Do you not see gas deals as treating Azerbaijan seriously? And do you not believe that the Western soft approach to Aliyev's regime, to Baku, actually resulted in Baku's withdrawal from the Western negotiation platform?
Well, what we see is a gas deal between the European Union and Azerbaijan that is much less than expected and much more than expected. It's much less than expected from the European side because it accounts for approximately 6% of domestic gas demand in Europe, and it really doesn't diversify European gas supplies. It's also more than expected because it's really a swap agreement between Russia, Azerbaijan, and the European Union, where for every amount of gas exported to Europe from Azerbaijan, Russia simply matches that with a resupply of gas to Azerbaijan. So this swap agreement is actually an insult to the stupidity of the European Union officials who negotiated this. At the same time, the second part of your question is interesting because I would argue the West, both the US and the EU, have moved away from their soft approach and realize they don't have much leverage over Azerbaijan, but it is time to talk tough. And in this regard, there is a dangerous precedent, not for Armenia, but a threat to the European Union and to the West. And that is the war of 2020, the loss of Karabakh, the forced expulsion, ethnic cleansing of the Armenians from Karabakh. These are precedents validating Azerbaijan's use of force and stand as victories of authoritarian power over democracy. This set of precedents undermines European values and undercuts US policy. In this regard, Azerbaijan should be seen as a direct challenge and threat in open defiance of the West.
Thank you for this opportunity one more time.
Thank you.
Founding director of the Regional Studies Center think tank, Richard Giragosyan, sat down with the First Analytical tonight.